freebies, and as well as that, we do short courses. Nancy, I think you're making a little bit of a weird noise.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
Or is
didn't do
it
it.
me? Or is it
I can't
me?
hear
I hope
anything.
it's not me. You can't hear me.
No, I can't hear anything. That's weird.
Okay, now it's gone. Okay, so without much further ado, I will let Nancy wow you with her seminar.
Hello, everyone. I'm just going to share my slides here. We will. Can everybody see the slides?
I
That look good?
cannot. Oh, yep. Now we're in.
There they are. Okay. We'll put the PDF of these slides up shortly after this, and we'll also have a video available as well. So I'm going to be talking about what happens to your research when it meets a global pandemic. So let me just get started. Okay, there we go. We've got a pandemic. What are we going to do? Obviously, since March, I think all of our lives have changed quite dramatically. And in our area, academic research area, it's changed where we work. I hardly go into the office anymore. I'm mostly at home every day, working from home. How we work remotely, and I chat with the people I work with on Slack, and we do video calls and do lots of things by email. Who we work with. So depending on whether or not you can go into your office, you may actually end up working with no one in person. And what kind of work that we can do, and amongst other really important things, but I'm just focusing on the academic research side. And this is just to give you a little picture into how my work situation has changed. Every Friday we have consultant meetings, and since March, I have most Fridays tried to wear a different type of headwear. And so I appreciate my coworkers tolerating my ridiculousness. And here's just a sample of the headwear that I have worn over the last 8 months or so. Obviously, with all the far-reaching effects of the pandemic on our society as a whole, it affects our research just as much. From the very beginning through to the end where you're disseminating your results. The things that you do have changed, and so you need to adjust for that situation. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about the practical aspects of those changes, and a little bit on the statistical side, but there's not going to be much stats talk here at all. In fact, there are no equations whatsoever. Most of it is going to be practical advice and things to think about when you are planning your study or actually conducting or doing your analysis. So if you're still at the planning stage, if you haven't actually started collecting your data yet and you're still trying to figure out what you're going to do, you can ask yourself one big question. Do you want to collect data in person? And if you think about it and go, yeah, everything is just too uncertain, I don't want to. You'd have some really great options for your research project. So for example, you could decide you're going to work on a meta-analysis. And, or you could say, hey, I want to do a retrospective study where I'm combining databases and I'll answer my research question that way. Maybe you're actually still interested in collecting data, you just don't want to do it in person at all. So instead you want to do some online data collection. So you could turn to Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey to get some survey data. Or if you actually are doing experimental tasks that can be done online, you can use something like Mechanical Turk to put your experiment up and get some data as well. So here are some considerations for these options. So first of all, it's meta-analysis. This is it's a fantastic way to contribute to the literature, and it's considered a really great way, assuming that it's done really well, to gain some more certainty around a particular effect that you're interested in. And this is actually a really popular choice for honors students and ILP students, particularly in the clinical schools, because they don't have to have patient contact, and they can do this one project, get this paper for their big research project done in the time allotted. The things that you need to think about, though, before you do a meta-analysis is that you have to be able to define your research question really specifically. And that means that you really need to talk with your supervisor if you're a student. So really talk a lot with your supervisor, because most likely they have a really good handle on the current literature in that area. And they can direct you to refining a research question that's going to be allow your process of finding the studies that address that. It's going to make that a lot easier if you can make sure that your research question is refined and very specific. Now, the one other thing that you need to think about is that this can actually be sort of time-consuming, because you need to read a lot of papers. You need to read a lot of research and extract all of the information possible that's relevant to your research question from each of those articles. Especially if your research question is not very constrained and very specific, you can end up with hundreds of articles that are looking at your research question. So you make sure that if you do this, you are able to finish the data collection in the time that you need. And to do it well, you need to be meticulous in documenting your process, not just for your own information, but this is something that you need to include in your paper as well. And depending on your chosen topic, the analysis can actually be quite complex. A lot of people come to me and they have only had experience with RevMan, which is the software that you can get from the Cochrane collaboration. Unfortunately, that is a very limited meta-analysis package, and so many things that people might want to synthesize a larger meta-analysis around, RevMan can't handle. And some of those effects can be not just treatment differences or group differences, but they can be other types of effects as well that are really out of the scope of something such as RevMan. So depending on your chosen topic, the analysis could become complex statistically. So get some help. And then there's some link to the Cochrane training where they talk about the process of meta-analysis for your information. Okay, so your second option here is research databases. And this is great for retrospective studies. You don't have to collect data, it's already been done. And you can combine lots of different sources of data to address your research questions. So maybe you're interested in how people, maybe youth with mental health issues, interact with the public education system. And so you might want to get some data from the MBS and the PBS and Department of Education in all the different states and territories in Australia. And obviously, they're all going to have lots of different information from each state, and it's all going to come in a different format. And that leads to one of the big difficulties with these types of research, and that is data linkage. It can be a very difficult and very lengthy process to actually connect those sources of data into a format that will allow you to address your research question. If you are not technically capable or oriented, this can be a really, really big difficulty in your research. In addition, the access to some of these databases can be very difficult. You often have to apply to many different, get approval from many different organizations in order to access the data. And so that can take a long time. And in addition, often these data sets you have to pay for. So if you don't have if you don't have grant support, It may be very expensive in order to access some of these databases. And once again, depending on your chosen topic, the linkage and analysis can be quite complex statistically, so get some help. Okay, online data collection. First of all, it's so easy. It's the packages that are available for you to put some things up onto the web to collect data are really quite user-friendly. Qualtrics is very easy. SurveyMonkey is very easy for you to create a survey and get some survey data. And you can get lots of data pretty quickly depending on who you're targeting. So this is a fantastic way to get data quickly from a lot of people. One thing to think about, though, is that survey design is actually, it sounds easy, but it's actually not as easy as it sounds. So you need to make sure that the way that you're asking the question and the way that you're allowing people to respond will allow you to get the data you need to answer your research question adequately. So even if you think you've got all of your questions all set, it's a good idea to have a person who's experienced in these things to take a look and just make sure that it looks as good as you think it needs to be. And depending on your chosen topic, the survey or experiment and analysis can be quite complex statistically. Get help. And that's, you'll see that in just about every slide in this presentation, the recommendation is to get some help. Even if it's just to check to make sure that what you've done is okay. If anything out of this talk, it's that get the help that is available to you. So there you go. Takeaway message. Think carefully about your question and also ask for help. Okay, so what if you are a researcher who actually does want to collect data in person? Well, first of all, you want to make sure that if you're going to be collecting data in person, you are following your institution's guidelines on in-person contact. So that may mean limiting the number of people you have in an enclosed space or even outside. That may mean keeping distance or wearing masks. But I would definitely have you refer to your institutions if you're a UNSW HDR student or researcher. UNSW has their own guidelines. And also big grant lending agencies have their own advice for their researchers. So I would direct you also to check out the advice from NHMRC or the ARC for their grantees. So definitely check those things out. And so that's sort of a practical thing. But one of the things that happens because we have this social distancing thing that we need to adhere to now is that in-person data collection is reduced, or it can even be stopped. Sometimes you may have to just stop it altogether, or you won't even be able to do it at all. Even if it isn't stopped, the people from whom you want to gather data may be less available. Perhaps, if you think about the Victoria lockdown recently, one of the restrictions that they had was people could not go farther than 5 kilometers away from where they live. So if you're in a situation like that, where people can go out but not really, the people who live farther away aren't going to be able to get to you to do that in-person data collection. So you're going to have some difficulties that way. And another thing to think about as you are planning a study is that you should really consider if your recruitment goal is feasible within the time frame. With these reduced numbers of people that can be in the same place at the same time, you may not be able to get data as quickly as you did before for a similar study that you did 2 years ago. So you need to really think about when you're planning your study, is your 1 month of recruitment time going to be enough to get that in-person data that you want? when you all have to adhere to the social distancing and sanitization rules and all of that. So just because you think that, yes, you can get those 250 people, is it really feasible for you to get that in with that 1 month, or do you need to extend it to 6 months in order to allow everyone to adhere to those distancing rules? So impacts on ongoing research. So that was planning when you're getting ready to do a study. What about for studies that are already going on? You've already started and collected your data, or collecting your data. Certainly at the very beginning, when everything sort of stopped, often I've had several people come to me with the data from a research study that they were doing that had to quickly stop collecting any data at all from March. And they were wondering, what do I do now? Or it could be that certainly when we have these little hot spots of COVID popping up, that certain areas are restricted. For example, one of our consultants does a lot of work with bees, so environmental sciences and earth sciences. And she mentioned that one of her students came to her and said they couldn't finish collecting all of their soil samples in the Victoria sites that they had planned on going to because they couldn't get into Victoria. So while they're still able to do work in New South Wales, they can't actually do all of their work that they had planned on. And once again, you may not be able to complete the planned study in the time frame predicted. Just because of shutdowns or social distancing. It's going to take a lot longer to finish your data collection than it might be otherwise. And once again, if you're doing work that is grant funded, you often have to provide updates on how that project is going. And certainly for this year, I'm sure a lot of people are going to be writing that they really didn't make as much progress or any at all due to these issues. And so I know that NHMRC has provided some advice to the grant holders on what to do because you're not even able to meet any of those time points and goals that you'd stated in your grant proposal process. So contact the grant agencies and also the grants management office. They can give you some advice on where to get some information, what to do next. Okay, so moving on, now we're going to sort of move into some statistical types of issues here, rather than just practical. Okay, so if you can't collect data anymore, or people can't get to you to give you their data, that means that you're going to have missing data. And it feels really scary when you go missing data because of COVID. Oh my God, what am I going to do with that? But it turns out that it might not actually be that big a deal. We have tools which you have probably already heard of or used that can help address this, even though it sounds kind of scary. So, if you've done any longitudinal research at all, you may have seen plots that look like this if you're plotting individual people over time, where you've got some people who give you all the time points observations, but not very many. And everybody has something, but most people don't come back all the time. And this is sort of what happens with COVID, where maybe you've got some people who finished their repeated measures, some people who were halfway through and can no longer come back, some people who only had their baseline measures. And so you end up with lots of data at the very beginning and much less toward the end. And that is actually a pretty typical thing for longitudinal data. So there's nothing here in the structure of the data that's much different from what you would expect anyway. So when you have fewer cases in your data set than what you expect, you're going to have less power, reduced power to detect the effect that you had planned for. That's just what happens when you have a smaller sample. You've got much less certainty around your estimate, and you're not quite as likely to find that effect if it's actually there. Missing data when you have COVID missing data as well. Researchers, people who have wrote this this paper that I'm going to be referring to quite a bit, Cho et al. 2020, have provided some guidelines for how to think as a researcher about your research in these times. So basically, what they're saying is, go back to the very beginning. Just think very carefully about what you're doing. First of all, you now need to think about, do you want to estimate that effect in a world that includes a pandemic, or a world that doesn't include a pandemic? And they get kind of specific about what that means in their paper, so I refer you to that. I don't want to spend too much time on what that means, but there'll be a couple examples coming up where it's obvious whether you're talking about a world with or without a pandemic. Also, you need to think about whether participants are directly affected by COVID-19. By directly affected, I mean, are they by infection themselves, or by changes in treatment or routine? Particularly if you are doing health research, this might be something that you need to be very careful about. Not so much for other types of in-person research, but it is something to consider. Also, whether loss to follow-up, attrition in longitudinal studies occurred prior to the pandemic or after. If it occurs prior, then you definitely have some sort of different systematic missing mechanism than you do if loss to follow-up occurs after. And Cho et al. Provide these 4 steps to help guide your research here. So first, clarify the treatment estimate, meaning what thing you're trying to estimate. So clarify the treatment estimate of interest with respect to the occurrence of the pandemic, and that is the world with or the world without a pandemic. Establish what data is missing for the chosen world state that you're working in, because that can change what you're considering missing versus not missing. Perform your analysis under the most plausible missing data assumptions, and I'm going to show you that this is not very scary. And then do sensitivity analyses under plausible alternative assumptions. Now, each of these are really things that you already do. Maybe you're not aware that you're sort of doing these, especially step 1 and step 2, but you already do these when you're doing your research. So there's nothing here that they are suggesting that you don't already do when you are planning and conducting your study. And here's a handy flow chart. I'm not going to to show this in any more detail. I would refer you to the paper if you want to take a look at what this says. But this just says at each step, what's your decision? What are you trying to consider? And then, given you've made that decision, what next you need to consider? I would definitely, if you want to take a look at this, and if you are doing some COVID type research or research that may be affected by COVID missing data, please check out this article. Okay, getting back to the practicalities of your statistics and your data. When you have missing data in a pandemic, one good thing about this missing data is that we have a really good idea why some of that missing data that's happened since March, why it may be missing. Because either we've stopped our study, or the participants aren't able to get to us to continue the study. So we have a really good idea of why stuff is missing from mid-March or so to the present. And that means that we can include this reasonable assumptions about that missingness in our analysis, which is really great because it doesn't really change the process of what we're going to do from what we would have done had we not run into this particular missing data problem. It's likely, and I will not say this is definitely the case for your data, but it is very likely that the missing data that you have after the pandemic, it still meets the criteria required for assuming missing at random data. Now, missing at random means that the missingness, the patterns of missing data, does not depend on the participants' unobserved data values. You've observed that there's a pandemic and you know about when it started, so that's good. So once we've taken into account the information on the observed data, we can assume, oh, everything else is random. All the other missing things is random. So we can still use statistical models such as linear mixed models or other types of mixed models to analyze all participants' data and give an unbiased estimate of our effect, even if there are missing observations, as long as we specify the model correctly. Now, you go, oh, as long as we specify the model correctly, but that's something that we do all the time anyway. We always want to make sure that we're specifying the model correctly. In this case, we just have to have a little bit more. So there's nothing different here than we would have done in the process anyway. And in addition, because we most likely have this missing at random status for our data, we can do multiple imputation rather than having to model the mechanism and we use a lot more assumptions about how the missing data occurs in our modeling. So really, before I get into other ideas for ongoing research, the effects that COVID might have on your data collection process or the ability for people to give you data don't really change what you were going to do with the data anyway. So while it is definitely something to make sure that you are considering, it actually doesn't change what you're going to be doing except for the model specification itself. It is a concerning thing because you have missing data, and that is always a concern, but is not an over and above that in particularly something to focus on too much. Okay, so if you are still collecting data and that COVID has changed some things about your data or your study, here are some things that you can do. If you're not able to answer your research question or some ideas to add on to your research question, if possible. So first of all, if you can't actually answer your research question anymore, can you change it? This is, I mentioned the BEAS student who came to one of our consultants who was no longer able to go into Victoria to gather their data. So instead of having a research question that focused on examining the relationship between two variables and sampling across all values of one of those variables, they instead changed it to a pilot data that looked at the best way to sample at different values of their variable. So instead of looking at a relationship, they were looking at, basically, they made it into a pilot study that will be useful for a further study later on. In addition, you could do something like, can you include a COVID-related hypothesis? And this is a question that firmly rests in the world with a pandemic hypothesis. If you have a COVID-related hypothesis in your study that you could include, obviously you are assuming that there is a pandemic involved. With this type of approach and changing your research question, you are very firmly in the, yes, I'm assuming a world with a pandemic, and I want to know how that pandemic affects our outcomes. So you could, if you're doing an RCT, you could examine the overall effect of COVID on your outcome if you think that's an important thing to talk about. So you could add on a hypothesis or change it altogether. Finally, maybe you could add in COVID-related questions in your data collection Another one of our consultants has a lot of students in one of the clinical schools that do survey data collection. And they started adding in pre and post, COVID behavior type items in their surveys just to see how people are reporting things have changed for them. Okay, so overall, what I would recommend is, first of all, think very carefully about your study design. Are you going to be collecting your data in person or not? Or even if you're going to be collecting data at all, if you've decided to go the database route. Think about your research question. Can you change it if you're no longer able to address your original research question well? Does it assume a COVID-free world? And if it does, what are the implications for moving on to your actual analyses? Would it be interesting if it assumed our current COVID reality? So maybe your RCT was generated under a COVID-free world, but maybe it's interesting to include COVID in there. Think about how to address the resulting missing data in your data analyses, including your multiple imputation or missing or sensitivity analyses. And finally, once again, if you have any uncertainty or need any guidance or advice, please get help. If you're wondering what even a multiple imputation is, but you think you need to do that before your study, definitely come to us or find somebody who knows about these things to pick their brains. Get help. So thank you very much. I appreciate that. And here are the reference. As I said, I'll put the PDFs of these up, and you guys can download these. You have all the resources that I refer to in the talk. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Fabulous chat. Are there any questions? Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question, or ask one in the chat function? Okay, it doesn't look like there are any questions, but there was quite a lot of information. So hopefully you'll come to us if you have any further questions about any of your missing data. Oh, Daniela.
Yeah, okay. For natural sciences. Daniela asked about advice for natural sciences. It's hard for me to give any particular advice without knowing the research environment in which and your research question. But if you're talking about natural sciences, like doing like biology and doing lab research, I think you may have problems or issues getting your data done because of social distancing. We have pretty strict distancing rules and guidelines in the labs now. So that may affect your data collection and increase the time it takes to get your data analyzed. And also, if you're working with other people, you might have to adhere to those rules as well. I think that the situation about the bees student probably applies here as well. That if it turns out that you can't do some types of research in the lab anymore because of new COVID guidelines, maybe your what you have now can be transformed into a different research question. Helene Smith asked send a link to the papers I was referencing. I'll put the PDF of my slides up and probably shortly after this, and you guys can download them.
Okay, thanks everybody. Hope you are we having another seminar, Nancy? Or is this
I think we are.
I think we're probably going to have another seminar in the year, so hopefully see you there.
Yeah.
Okay.